All right, here we go. I'm sorry. What do you need? No. My wife is just trying to rob me. Okay. I don't have any money. All right, so here we go. So let's start our interview with Martin Shaw, mythologist. And it is Dr. Martin Shaw, if I'm correct, correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, and what's your doctorate in?
Well, it's in mythology. My
Okay,
my PhD was on the relationship between metaphor and wilderness rites of passage, and specifically through a Siberian and Irish lens. But
nice. And where was that?
that was at the University of Plymouth, which is
Okay,
just down the road from me, just before
okay,
you get into Cornwall.
okay, wonderful. So we'll start with I have five questions, which I think will be plenty, and I'm sure we'll take a few digressions. And here's the first one. One of my vocations, perhaps the central one, is that of the poet. And all of my other roles seem to circle around this one, even that of husband and father. I was also a Waldorf teacher and master teacher for 16 years, where storytelling is a primary pedagogical tool. So this is a long way of saying that I get how important the story is. And I wonder if you could say something about the essence of story and its importance.
Good question. I'll come around in this very odd way,
It's fine.
because I'll come around to something that I'm thinking about right now, which is, you must have read uh, the essential book by Mircea Eliade in the early 60s, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy.
Absolutely.
And in that book, it was reviewed by Ted Hughes as a young man, fairly young guy. And Ted Hughes describes shamanism as what did he call it? Something like the sort of the essential poetic event. And that led me to thinking today that I regard the crucifixion as the major poetic event.
That's
The
right.
the thing, the great, the sublime catastrophe from which everything else has been circling from ever since. So I now realize that the stories I'm telling and the importance of the stories I'm telling, although I've done it, blind, to be honest, for 25 years, is that they're pointing towards, the great poetic event. And obviously now as a Christian, I see that with a completely different emphasis and set of eyes to something that I had 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Uh, I I grew up. I'm talking to you today from the edge of Dartmoor in the West Country of Britain, 365 square miles of wilderness where it's still possible to get unstuck, and to get into deep waters. Now in America, that's nothing, but over here, that's still a good stomp of the wild. And I realized, again, I'm just giving you like the fresh bread straight out of the oven. This is
Right.
today's thinking. Um, is that I went into a wood to be wedded to the wild, and I came out wedded to Christ. And I realized that both of those weddings are facing each other. And the problem we have in modern Christianity and in many pagan circles is they think they're looking away from each other, and they're not. I'm with Augustine. I think that Christianity is the great, in somehow, against all the evidence, it is still the great accomplishment of paganism in a way. So this rehydrates and shakes up completely my understanding of being a storyteller, and what in the years coming that what do I want to talk about? What would it be like to tell the story of Samson for 3 days? What would it be
Yeah.
like to have a really sophisticated mythopoetic undertaking of all sorts of elements of the Bible, even with the different genres that are sort of competing as we go. Story, as I'm sure you will know this, stories are literally a storehouse. They have lots and lots of secreted secrets in them, especially when they come from oral cultures where they're not writing stuff down. And so they are slipping them in, they're slipping all this Gnostic information I don't mean that in terms of the religious emphasis, but occulted information into stories so it moves generationally from community to community. And if a story does not have that, it seems to me it won't really be remembered. One of the things I'm very interested in is my great uncle was a man called Hamer Broadbent. And Hamer Broadbent was a Plymouth Brethren missionary in the early 1900s, who ironically, irony of ironies, bearing in mind I'm about to be received into the Orthodox Church, had an absolute loathing of what he called priestcraft. He just couldn't stand it.
Right.
He went around places like Transylvania and Siberia and the Baltics and even the Arctic, sort of almost sort of interfering with or protecting or getting involved with sort of indigenous cultures, and sometimes Jewish actually in Poland, protecting them against, you know, the more corrupted elements of the church. But the stories that come from the regions that Hamer moved in are very compelling to me. And the reason they're compelling is, say, Siberia, you do not have yet great, easily accessible anthologies of those stories. And what that means is they haven't gone through the gone through the sort of cheese grater of the, you know, Parisian salons,
Right.
and all sorts of sneaky little references and turnings to the politics. They're still rural. They're still electrifying. They're still very strange. They've still got the fur on them. You still get the feeling you're not dealing with a pelt. You're dealing with an animal.
Right.
And so I suppose the stories I'm compelled by, and I think the ones that we need, especially in a time of sort of, you know, climate emergency of that, are the ones that remind us that in some very essential kind of way, the earth seems to think and communicate in myth.
Nice. Thank you. And I've actually, it's a great segue into my next question, because you've written about that wonderful movement in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries when serious people, academics, psychologists, poets, and the like the Grimms, Freud, Yeats, Jung, Karenyi, Campbell, and so forth, started to take stories, myth, legends, and fairy tales, and so forth, seriously. But that this movement also got a little stuck in interpreting these stories as mostly related to psychological states or processes, right? I also have a lot of admiration for that period, as well as for those like Cecil Sharp and Alexander Carmichael, who went about collecting the folk songs, ballads, prayers, and charms that were quickly disappearing from the world, right? And I like that. To me, it's a miracle that they went out and caught all those things before they can completely vanish. And you've done a yeoman's job of making sure this tradition stays alive, or at least present unto our memory, to paraphrase John Donne. But how do we keep it alive? Is it ever to be on the cusp of vanishing?
I think probably it will always be on the cusp of vanishing. I'm going to come back to this question, but I'm sure you've read these books. But have you come across George Ewart Evans? His book, The Pattern Under the Plough.
Right. Mm-hmm.
These are phenomenal collections where he in the early 1900s he was going around East Anglia and collecting. He suddenly realized that farmhands had a better linguistic reach, a more imaginative mind than people he was meeting in cities.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sorts of arguments for like quite why this was happening, but he collected these incredibly image-centered turns of phrase. He said, you know, no one would talk about the autumn. They'd call it beet singling time. Everything was kind of connected to something you could eat or smell or feel. And like you, I recognize this as a sort of an intensely precious movement towards just our natural, the natural humanness of things, the natural soul of things. Now, what is going to happen? I mean, as I think about, you know, the advent, I've talked about this a lot in the past, but you'll be aware that you and I are spending an enormous amount of our lives now looking half a foot ahead of each other at glowing screens.
Mhm.
And the kind of stories and cultures that we like, especially if they're hunting cultures, have an enormous attention to things on the periphery of their vision. So I'm just worried about the periphery of our imaginative vision and our practical vision, that everything, and it's mangling our eyes at the same time.
Absolutely.
So I suspect, sadly, although I'm always open to the miraculous, I'm not riding a carpet of doom. I'm always open to, it's a bigger, weirder world than any of my predictions. But things seem progressively more insipid, and more like we're dealing with facsimiles and photocopies of things rather than the real thing.
Mhm.
I could get drawn into, but I don't have the energy today, the whole artificial intelligence thing.
Right.
I think, yeah, I think on the other hand, especially with younger people that I know, and you will chime with this, I'm sure, through your background as a teacher, is that younger generations are always going to surprise us in their innate nose towards the real. They just will. And you do find young people fasting on hills. I do feel, though, I go along with the Aboriginal idea that modern culture is only 3 days deep. And although these things feel very encrusted on us and hopeless, and there's no way to get back to something of sustenance and meaning, it doesn't take long with an empty stomach in a wood or on the top of a hill for strange shit to happen. When strange shit happens, um, reality alters, you lose your existential dread, which is such a tremendous relief. And you realize, in the words of Gaston Bachelard, that the world seeks to be admired by you. It wants to communicate across species to you. And the kind of stories that I think we need more than ever. And interestingly, I think that we are going to find them in my work and others in reviving like strange old stories of the Christian saints in Ireland.
Right.
There are these stories with tremendous ecological intelligence and deeply feminine as well.
Mhm.
So that whole bit gets brought into the light.
Yeah, I'm great. Oh, I mean, so nice to hear you mention Gaston Bachelard, because a lot of people in the Anglosphere don't know who he is, and he's such an important thinker, especially for thinking in this kind of phenomenological way of being present to nature and being present to things as they are. Right? Wonderful. And that's a, so so I know that you spent 4 days without food in the wilds, but then you also spent 4 years living in a tent. Was that in England, or was that in Wales?
No, funnily enough, it was kind of on the Welsh border. It
Okay.
was on the Welsh border. The realize there's a slight question about that, because the initial fast was in Wales. It was in Snowdonia.
Okay.
And then I came back to England, left London. I had a job as a musician. I was signed to Warner Brothers and things. And then I ended up living sort of again on the hinge between the two countries for 4 years. And I had been rendered almost incapacitated by what had actually happened up in Snowdonia.
Hmm.
And it was then that I thought, well, hold on. The therapy speak of mid-90s, sort of that you were, the way it just,
Right.
it wasn't for me. It was one handrail too many. It
Uh-huh.
was one handrail too many. And I realized that actually I needed a kind of imagistic, I needed the images I'd gone through to be larger, not smaller. They weren't to be made containable or tamed. And that's when I remembered, Irish myths, Russian fairy tales. I remembered the Odyssey, all of that. I must say, I don't know what, I bet your life's been a bit like this. I didn't have any kind of franchise plans when I was living I had no phone, had no computer. You remember, there was a time one could just go away.
Right.
And I was just under just managed to get that bit of time at the end of the last century, but I didn't know what to do with it. I was just dwelling, I guess, in what James Hillman would call the poetic basis of mind. That's what that's what I'd been short-circuited into on the mountain. And then over the years that followed, I realized that it was going to be an interesting mystery to try and talk about it through stories.
Right.
Otherwise, I would just be telling my own story all the time, which is horribly tedious.
I know. Nothing I get sick of more than myself. But it reminded me, I'm sure you know this story. I think in must have been the late 80s. I was at a poetry reading in a small little cafe, and Robert Bly was giving a reading.
Oh yeah.
And he told a story about Joseph Campbell, who couldn't get a job during the Great Depression and went out into the woods with a shotgun and a couple of boxes of shells and all the great books and myths and fairy tales and Nietzsche and Hume and whatever. And he fed himself by shooting partridge and reading all those great stories, right? Which was the beginning of his his career as a mythologist, right? And so your story, to a degree reminds me of that. And I actually had a conversation with students yesterday. I'm a professor, and we were talking about all this craziness with transhumanism and AI. And I was asking them, so, they're all 20 years old. I said, so what do you think is the antidote to this? And I was impressed, like you just said, a couple of them said, finding the space to contemplate was one of the things one of the students said. Finding a way to get out and to enter into a relationship, as you said, with the real. So what did you return with from that sojourn into the wilderness? And by the way, I love Snowdonia. What a beautiful place. I was there about 30 years ago.
Oh, a similar time.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't return with much financially. There was nothing on the horizon. I'd left school without qualifications, you see, and I'd just been a musician. So there was no I'd never been, quote unquote, a bright kid, but I was imaginative. I knew that. And so I think I came out of the tent. Well, the first thing that happened was I met 3 people who were willing and interested to come every now and then and sit with me and find out more about these old stories, walk the land, go through a little bit of sort of initiatory process themselves. In other words, prepare to do a vigil. And they used to pay me a nominal amount to do that. And it worked out for a few years, rather like a kind of part-time job. I didn't have an email or anything, but you will remember the days that everyone's forgotten now of actually putting flyers up in bookshops and hoping that someone walked by, and then I'd been doing that for about 3 years, and I had an opportunity, which was I cannot emphasize now how important it was I'm living in this completely obscure part of the West Country, and I'm invited to go to meet Robert Bly at this thing called the Great Mother Conference in Maine. And I leave England, I get to the conference after the flights had gone wrong, and I'd ended up outside the airport in Newark, and someone tried to rob me.
Wow.
My first conversation in
Welcome to America
was a negotiation with the guy who'd stolen my wallet. And it was a great trickster moment, because I kept up. He created this fiction that I was asleep and he just needed a buck and he had to take my wallet and passport. And I retained the fiction with him, so we could both kind of tiptoe out of this collision, and ended up giving him some money. But the point of it is that by 10 o'clock that next morning, I was in the company of Robert Bly, Galway Connell, Jane Hirschfield, James Hillman might have been there, but like it was night and day to my imaginative reality, night and day. And Bly was still functioning as a teacher at that point. In the evening, Coleman Barks would be there reading Rumi with sitar. I'd hear the loons coming up from the lake, and I knew it was wonderful. I was 33, and I thought, I'm having what they used to call a peak experience. This is as good as culture can possibly get. This is it. This is it. Little did I know, within half a decade, I would inherit that conference from Bly and lead it for a decade, because I just had this. I was like the last runt through the door, in terms of being around one of the real old growth dinosaurs.
Right.
I mean that in a very positive sense.
Yeah.
So I was around, a level of intellect and spiritual inquiry and general kind of Viking gusto that just, if you weren't ready for it, he would just chew you up and you were gone. But if you could cope with it, you were entering the force field of an incredibly generous human being. So that's really the big thing, is up until I leave the tent, it's a struggle, but it's absorbing. And then suddenly I'm sort of on Bly's radar, and through the Great Mother Conference and another conference, the Minnesota Men's Conference, I think candidly, over that decade, I learned my stuff.
Wow. Well, that's interesting. Like you, I mean, I started out as a musician as well. I might think my way into poetry, into what I do now, was through the guitar, through playing the guitar. Yeah, but around that time is when I met Bly, and it was profoundly moving for me because it was just a short, hour, and I get to talk to him for a little bit, but he made me feel seen as a man, which I don't think it ever happened. I probably did. I took it for granted when it came from my father, but I felt, well, here's a guy who can see me. It's nice. I'm not used to this reality, and it was wonderful, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And he he gave me a permission, in a way, to think poetically and to think that wasn't abnormal. You know what I mean? Now, related to that, here's my next question is, you have, like you, I have been called a romantic on more than one occasion. And I accept and acknowledge that designation. So I'd like to know, what is romanticism to you, and why is it important?
Well, I think let's begin with the old notion of, truth and beauty. And I think those things matter, especially beauty. And so I'm with the historic tradition of the Romantics. And I think particularly because, as Harold Bloom said, the Romantics are the interiorized version of the old myth tellers of the Homeric era. They rather than going out into the world, they've gone deep inside themselves and are producing, incredible poetry. You see, we're living in a time where everything from Europe is regarded as colonial and corrupted.
Right.
But that's far from the case when it comes to, especially people like Friedrich Hölderlin and the Germans had tremendous energy and anger towards what was happening with the Industrial Revolution. Now, I think a really interesting question for the two of us and in the future would be to go back to Owen Barfield, thinking, funnily enough, about Rudolf Steiner. And it's his question is, what does romanticism come of age look like? What could it look like?
Right.
Now, for me, a romanticism come of age is one that is imbued with Lorca's Duende. It's something that actually has an underworld experience in it, but not one that kills you in that early Kurt Cobain-esque iteration of being dead at 27, but actually has something of the quality of Cy Twombly or Picasso, or artists that actually kept steady, kept developing, kept deepening through their whole lives. So I'm by no means done with romanticism is the oxygen that I breathe. It's the water that I swim in, but I still think that it's in movement. And I mean, for example, there's a great young Dene, Navajo poet called Jake Skeets. Now, Jake Skeets for me is the best romantic poet that I've read recently. And his poems are about living on a reservation as a young man and realizing he's gay in a culture that is not conducive to that, or not a small community. And so I've been writing about him recently. I'd be saying, well, could you even get away with calling this romantic poetry? Does it seem so Eurocentric a phrase that it's not allowed to live? But I come back to romanticism, and I come back to it because I think it's a legacy that you can't escape. And I think that what people want at the moment is anything with the word wild in it, or with the word animistic in it, or some groovy phrase that removes you from the weight of the inheritance of romanticism. But the weight of the inheritance of romanticism, which goes back to, the great mythological stories, is what has kept the fertility of wildness alive,
Right.
In so much of the world that we're in today. So I'm interested in what I would regard as a romantic sensibility, but is not tied up with youth. It's not tied up with, dying young. It's got the weathering of the underworld in it as well. And again, it's back to this essential romanticism come of age.
Right. I like that kind of well, I think some of the things that seem to be very lacking in our society are that kind of wildness you're talking about, that is not the mass-produced wildness, that inhabits all beer commercials, right? But that wildness, in fact, where I live, we live on the edge of a state wilderness area, on a small farm, and it's still pretty wild here, and which is nice. And but you see that where this wildness, as you're talking about, in the relationship to nature, that the romantics really embodied, seriously, the German romantics as well as the English romantics. And but you see, like you mentioned, the dying young, that was kind of celebrated in almost in pop culture about the romantics. But what's lacking in there is the wisdom tradition, right? The coming to wisdom. I shouldn't say it's lacking, but that's what gets lost in the sauce, is the wisdom that comes with age. And I wrote in The Submerged Reality that one of the places where the romantics didn't come of age is because they didn't ever get grounded in a tradition, like Christianity is what I was thinking at the time, right? Where the Novalis kind of floated, he was moving in that direction before he died, certainly. And I think Hymns to the Night might be one of the greatest Christian poems ever constructed. And so I think that's important. What about this idea of wisdom? And I mean, I'm kind of imbued with sophiology in my own work, and I think wisdom as person, but also wisdom as tradition is it's not marketable, so it's disappearing from our world in a way. Just like myth and story is always in danger of vanishing, correct?
Yes. Excuse me.
Okay.
I've been thinking recently about the last 2 years of my life, having been a rather content and imaginatively very stimulated mythologist and professor and teacher for 2 decades or longer. Suddenly, I enter not just Christianity but orthodoxy, and it's as if Christ is this magnet, and kind of coming out of me are all these little particles of iron that have, up until this moment, been completely randomly scattered in my body. And then, almost to my horror, I see the wisdom tradition of orthodoxy giving myself a new shape, sometimes, rather against my will. And it reminds me actually of a Buddhist phrase, iron spine. It reminds me of this iron spine thing. And I think that you're onto something with romanticism, and I think you're onto something with the arts in general, is that it's, you know, in Hillman's, in Jung, it's puer stuff. That's what's celebrated.
Right.
So you can be flighty and clever and witty, but no one has any sense of changing the oil before you take a long car journey. Uh, no one is, you know, we all flee ordinary. We all flee ordinary. One of the problems I'm having as I realize that I need to not just be a Christian, but actually attend a church, for me is the sheer horror of being part of a human community. Because the nanosecond the liturgy is over, my every pore in my body is heading to the door. But I realize that the real challenge is not being able to physically stand up for the whole of the liturgy. It's what happens when the coffee comes out
Right.
and there's another 40 minutes of talking to people about absolutely anything they want to talk about. So I've slightly lost the thread, but yeah, remind me or respond.
No, what where I mean, so the wisdom, you know.
Oh yeah. So um, the wisdom tradition is unfashionable. You know, I was rather revulsed by the notion of wholeness until recently. I was much more of a reader, again, to circle back to James Hillman, who's someone I don't think about Jim much, but it, you know, Jung would talk about, he wasn't afraid to be the grand old man. He wasn't afraid to sort of gather things into his being. But Hillman was innately skeptical of that and said, oh, come on, give me a break. You know, much more of a kind of coyote figure. And the thing about a coyote figure is literally in those myths and stories, coyote's power lives at the tip of its nose and the tip of its tail. There's no centralized position for a coyote. And so I thought that was cool and groovy and loved that for decades. And I've noticed at my school of myth, everyone loves the notion of the trickster. No one wants to talk about, you know, figures like kings or queens. They get terribly uncomfortable.
Right.
But then you only have to talk to them for a moment about everyone's private life, and everyone's in absolute chaos because they have no centering principle. They are extremely ill at ease with the notion of morality or any kind of truth that isn't just sort of completely haphazard. And so, interestingly for me, yeah, I'm going through the grit at the moment of moving towards a Christian system where actually there's less interpretive wiggle room than some. But as you know, Orthodoxy also places, mercifully, it places great attention on mystery. And it's fine for a priest to turn around or a father and say, I simply don't know. And that's what I need, because I don't know most of the time.
Right. Well, and we feel like we should know all the time, right? And especially in this culture, right? Where everybody's an expert at everything. But also I think you're pointing out to something that's important. You know, talking not just tradition, but part of what goes with tradition is and wisdom is the reverence for the elder, and also the notion of the father, whether it's a biological father, a spiritual father, or God the Father. And as you know, right, the Anglican Church is about to do away with that language, which is talking about selling the farm, right? So I mean, I think that's important, and I think that, you know, we mentioned Bly, and you're talking about Hillman, and I think, you know, one of the things Bly talked about with Yeats, he called Yeats his male mother, right? Who nourished his soul in a masculine way, and he, I remember he said, you know, your male mother doesn't have to be someone who's alive. It can be somebody in the world. It could be somebody you encounter through other sources. And I think that's important. And I think that's and that's the thing, is those things we just mentioned, tradition, wisdom, the father and the mother, are the things being gradually erased from human culture right now in the West.
I know. I mean, just a quick thread with Blind the male mother. What would have also, I'm sure, been at the back of his head is the image of Zeus incubating Dionysus in his thigh.
Right.
That would have been and that's an initiatory image. It drives people crazy because they think it's a Greek way of eradicating the power of the feminine. But I don't see it like that. I see it as a motif for that second birthing that often goes on in an initiatory practice. So I don't think actually personally it's dissing the feminine. I just think it's referring to those male cults that would have gone at that time. I mean, goodness me, once we start to dissolve, it's frightening the rapidity in which you can dissolve something. I have a friend, I might have to send you a spelling of his name if we keep this, Yadran Mimika. Yadran Mimika. And Yadran Mimika is an anthropologist who in the late 70s and early 80s was over in Papua New Guinea, who had some of the most extreme and eye-watering initiatory practices you could possibly hope to meet. And interestingly, are a great deterrent for anybody that would ever think, if we could just reintroduce rites of passage, the world would be all right. You wouldn't think that after you heard what they were getting up to with the young men. But my point is that it really only took the whites turning up and offering them mobile homes and a television for that shit to be over. It was over.
Wow.
Immediately. Everybody leaves and just lives near the airport. Just lives near the airport in the box.
Yeah.
That it's that kind of peculiar passive magic that the West is so accomplished at. So the consequences, in other words, the consequences of trying to dissolve an old growth presence like a father, that's going to change the ecology of families. It's going to change the ecology of everything that we're growing up with. We're opening the doors to an experiment. We've become a human sort of petri dish where we've got a lunatic with their finger in just swilling everything around.
Right.
No idea what's going to happen next.
None at all. None at all. And we should probably, to wrap this up. Well, I actually want to ask you one more thing, because I caught an interview of yours yesterday where you're talking about Nicholas Black Elk.
Yeah.
And I have a picture of Nicholas Black Elk over my desk right now. With, you've probably seen a famous one where he's showing a little native girl a rosary. Beautiful picture. And now in the circles I used to travel in the 80s and early 90s, people were always talking about Black Elk Speaks. And I read it too, but I didn't know at the time that he eventually became practically a deacon in the Catholic Church. And then later, when these people I would talk to would say, yeah, they would get onto their Native American spirituality thing. I said, he became a deacon in the Catholic Church, right? And they would be horrified. They couldn't believe it. But I think as you're experiencing, as I have experienced, as Black Elk experienced, that there is something in Christianity that is the fulfillment of all the story, right? As you said at the beginning of our interview, right? There's something in Christianity that's the story that fulfills and makes true all stories in a way. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I am amazing. And I knew, I've been writing about him today. In fact, Nicholas Black Elk's grandson was a man called Wallace Black Elk, who was a very well-known, functioning, highly visible Lakota medicine man until probably the early 2000s. And he wrote a book called I think it's called Black Elk: The Sacred Ways of the Lakota.
Right.
Very interesting. One of the thing he keeps referring to actually is the idea, which you find in other books as well, is that indigenous cultures in native North America sort of knew about Jesus already.
Right.
So the missionaries come over and they're like, oh, it's it's that guy. It's as if, which I have a Celtic mindset, so that's tremendously fluid. And I can imagine Christ manifesting as many times as he wanted. So, who knows? But I think the interesting thing is that Nicholas Black Elk's innate indigenosity hopefully did not go up in smoke when he became a deacon. And what I'm really aware of in a lot of modern Christian polemics, again, it's because everything's a face-off rather than a conversation.
Right.
The notion that, you know, everything is false and indistinct, and the wild is the devil's playground, and all this horseshit. It's actually a far more complex picture than that. It's a much more complex picture than that. And so I'm heartened. I've done a kind of an inventory, Michael. It's been interesting. As someone that's told hundreds and hundreds of myths and folk tales for many years, I did wonder, you know, how is this going to feel in me now that I'm sort of orientated in an orthodox direction? And I think all the stories I was telling, to be honest, the reason I was organically led to them is they have all these what I'd call pinpricks of the eternal in them. So although sometimes members of my own family who've grown up very strongly Christian, they say, well, we can't find the Christ figure in the story. Where's the Christ figure in your story? And I said, well, the story is Christ.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The story, Christ is the relationship as well as the person. It doesn't always go down that well.
Yeah.
But I know what I mean.
Yeah.
I know what. So interest. All what I'm getting at is I don't feel I've had to sort of, whilst I am in a process of rapid change, I admit, by and large, I have not been sort of struck dumb from my previous mythological loves and engagement.
So as an aside, did your engagement with Parsifal, did that contribute to your coming to Christ?
No, it didn't actually, because I did the Parsifal work that I did is about 12 years ago, and I willfully avoided what I now realize is many Christian references within it. I just thought of
That's hard to...
but ironically, Michael, only last Saturday I told in its entirety all 411 pages from memory, not as a reading, but as a memory telling of Wolfram's book. And I was shattered when I'd finished.
Really?
And there is a completely different emphasis on the Grail King and the wound and all of it now. Everything feels very different. In the same way, I've been working on Gawain and the Green Knight, and I had one appreciation of that story for years, and now it's utterly different again. So I'm primarily interested in, you know, the notion of Christian mythology. I don't know what it was like for you, but I grew up and everything was, you know, do you believe? And when you're 4, I didn't believe in anything much. And it's interesting now, as a Christian, I don't approach the Gospels, for example, as kind of elongated metaphors. That couldn't make me bend my head. Right. I take them. I believe in them. You know, I see them on 20,000 different levels, but the level of the reality of Christ walking around a small region around a lake and bending reality, I take that. And if I didn't, I wouldn't have lingered with this. It wouldn't be derailing me in the way that it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's my experience. My experience as well. So finally, the theme of this year's Jesus the Imagination is the household of things, thinking in terms of the archaic and traditional meaning of the word economy, in particular what I am terming the economy of the real. Myth, fairy tales, legends are certainly part of that economy. In my own work, both literary, intellectual, and as a biodynamic farmer, I have really spent a lifetime trying to eliminate not only the madness of life inside the machine, as Paul Kingsnorth calls it, or the technocracy, as others have called it, but of the possible life or lives beyond it. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little.
Just give it to me again.
Okay. So I'm interested in the economy of the real, right? So where does your work, Christ, fit in this economy of the real in contradistinction to the machine that we're
Okay.
victims of.
Yeah. I think what it does, ironically, the economy of the real for me it's ironic because I have friendships with quite a few writers at the moment that are very interested in the word enchantment and the kind of reviving, especially in Christianity, of a kind of an enchanted consciousness. Whereas for me, actually, I view us living in a toxically enchanted environment most of the time. So for me, it's, Christ is, as T.S. Eliot says, we can only handle so much reality, and Christ shows us so much reality. We almost, he's kind of unbearable. Like, we can only see a little bit of Jesus, I think. And so anything that I really care about is a breaking of trance states, really. I also believe, well, if we're talking about the homestead, I'm a big believer in conviviality. I like people round the table being fed. And I love, we know in the early days of Christianity, the things they had on their side was lifestyle and story.
Right.
So I want to be like an early Christian, me and millions of other people.
Yeah.
Lifestyle and story, get people together, be visible, have that kind of confidence. Don't be tripping over yourself all the time. This is, it's bread and wine, it's the stuff of life. So yeah, that's all I would say. For me, the great enspellment is this. I'm deviating slightly, but modernity is good at desire and bad at longing. That's what it does. Amazon feeds your desire in a fraction of a second. Porn feeds your desire, but longing is a much more kind of nebulous note, and it's much harder to satisfy. And I remember, you probably remember this, it's an old Rumi quote, it's beautiful, from Coleman. It says, the feeling of the sensation of longing in your chest is God speaking back to you. It is the return journey. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And in other words, it's not something to be avoided or circumnavigated by getting yet another book through the post, which I am, of all sinners, I am the first. Terrible, man. Yeah, so I'm interested in the breaking of spells, really.
I like that. That's right. That's a good place to end. And hey, thank you so much for this time.
Absolute pleasure.
For me too. I think we have a lot in common, and I'm so glad to make your friendship.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's just a thrill to know that you're out there and you're doing this, fabulous, invigorating work, and you're so clearly naturally predisposed to do it. So, God bless you. And I do hope we meet down the road in real time.
I look forward to it. Okay, take care. God bless.
Bye-bye.